Lee Radziwill married a prince. She got the title. She got the money. So where's the tragedy? That question has been trailing Lee Radziwill's story for decades, surfacing every time someone tries to write her biography as a cautionary tale. The socialite, the princess, the sister who lived in Jackie's shadow, the mother who outlived her son, the woman who died in February 2019 with a $50 million estate and a reputation that never quite resolved into anything satisfying. The tragedy format requires something to be taken away, a future foreclosed, a life cut short, an innocent person crushed by circumstance. Lee Radziwill died at 85 in her Manhattan home. The tragedy framing is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Two questions tend to come up wherever her story gets discussed by people who've done the actual reading. First, the Bouviers weren't European aristocracy, so where did this family get the architecture for that kind of self-presentation? And second, was Lee the devoted mother that sympathetic retellings suggest? Or were her children raised, financially supported, and emotionally anchored by someone else? Neither question has a clean answer, but the evidence leans in a specific direction on both. Start with the Bouviers. Michel Charles Bouvier was born in 1792 in Pont-Saint-Esprit, a town in the south of France closer to Marseille than Paris, not the storied Parisian aristocratic origin the family mythology eventually claimed. He trained as a cabinet maker. He fought in Napoleon's army. After Waterloo in 1815, with France defeated and his prospects limited, he emigrated to Philadelphia and set up a furniture workshop. Over the following decades, he became one of that city's significant cabinet makers, producing pieces for elite clients including the Bonapartes, as a craftsman serving them, not as a peer sitting beside them. His real fortune came not from any ancestral estate, but from a piece of American luck. Investments in Pennsylvania forest land that turned out to sit on anthracite coal deposits. By his death in 1874, his estate exceeded $800,000. Self-made industrial wealth. American through and through. The aristocratic origin story came later, constructed by a specific person at a specific time. Jackie and Lee's grandfather, John Vernou Bouvier Sr., known as the Major, fabricated a genealogy of French noble ancestry that had no historical foundation. The New York Times, reviewing John H. Davis's 1969 family history. The Bouviers, Portrait of an American Family, described the earlier genealogical volume the family had privately printed as containing a noble but phony ancestry. Davis's book, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, is the primary scholarly account of the family, and its central finding is that the Bouviers were successful, ambitious Americans who invented their European pedigree rather than inheriting it. The fabrications compounded on the maternal side. Janet Lee Bouvier, Lee and Jackie's mother, was descended from Irish Catholic immigrants, not the Southern gentry she implied. She reportedly constructed a story connecting the family to Robert E. Lee to smooth over the social register's less flattering entries. Lee and Jackie were introduced to the mechanics of aristocratic performance before they were old enough to question whether the props were real. This matters for understanding what Lee did next, because the marriage to Stanislaw Radziwill looked, from the outside, like the mythology finally coming true. An American woman from a family that had always wanted to be European nobility marrying into a family that actually was. Stanislaw, called Stas, was born in 1914 in Spanov, in what was then the Russian Empire, the son of a family that carried one of the genuinely significant noble titles in Eastern European history. The Radziwill family's designation as Reichsfürst, Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, had been granted by Emperor Maximilian I in the early 16th century and confirmed for specific branches of the family by Emperor Charles V in 1547. The title was subsequently recognized by the Polish crown. The Radzywills built Neshviesch Castle. They served as chancellors of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They were related by blood to the Hohenzollerns, the Romanovs, and the Habsburgs. When Stas introduced himself as a prince, the historical claim wasn't fraudulent. The Radziwills were one of the genuinely great noble houses of Eastern Europe. But the German invasion ended all of that materially. By the time Lee met Stas in London in the mid-1950s, he was, as Vanity Fair's 2016 profile put it directly, virtually penniless, having survived the war by trading on nothing but his charm, his title, and his wits. He had married a Swiss heiress and rebuilt a real estate fortune, but the starting position was the title, not the money. And the title itself had been legally hollow since 1921, when Poland's March Constitution abolished aristocratic titles and privileges under Article 96. The wording was explicit. The Republic of Poland does not recognize hereditary or estate privileges, nor any coats of arms, hereditary titles, and the like. In Britain, where Stas had settled after the war, the situation was no better. He applied to Queen Elizabeth II for formal permission to use his princely title and was denied. He was permitted only informal courtesy use. He wasn't, in the eyes of British law, a prince. And in America, where Lee would eventually spend most of her life, the Constitution's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, prohibits any title of nobility from being granted or formally recognized by the United States government. The federal framework had foreclosed the possibility before Lee was even born. So what did Lee Radziwill become on March 19, 1959, when she married Stas in their civil ceremony? In the eyes of Polish law, the wife of a private citizen. In the eyes of British law, the wife of a man whose honorary title the crown had declined to formalize. In America, nothing with legal standing. Princess Radziwill was a social performance. It had no jurisdiction on earth, none of which stopped it from working exactly as intended. For 15 years, the title did what it was supposed to do. Lee and Stas lived at 4 Buckingham Place in London, close enough to Buckingham Palace for the address itself to function as a credential, and at Turville Grange, a 17th-century property on 50 acres an hour outside the city, which Lee decorated with set designer Renzo Mongiardino into what Vanity Fair described as a stunning showplace. She became one of Truman Capote's swans, present at his black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel on November 28, 1966. The social event of a decade, its 540 guests drawn from every stratum of the international elite. She appeared on the cover of Life magazine in July 1967. She wore Courrèges and smuggled Givenchy. Truman convinced her she could be an actress, which led to the Philadelphia story in Chicago in June 1967, reviews that were largely scathing, and a television movie called Laura in 1968, from which, according to Diana Dubois's 1995 biography, In Her Sister's Shadow, much of her performance ended up removed before broadcast. The title worked because enough people agreed to treat it as real. That is precisely how social performances function. 2 children arrived in the early years of the marriage. Anthony Stanislav Albert Radziwill was born August 4, 1959. Anna Christina, called Tina, followed in 1960. A premature delivery by cesarean that left both mother and infant in precarious health in London. Lee was still recovering when John Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States in January 1961. The Radziwills stayed in London and missed the ceremony entirely. Jackie walked into the White House without her sister there. The family lived primarily in England through the early 1960s. Anthony, as his New York Times obituary recorded, spent his childhood in England with his parents. Lee and Stas made frequent visits to Washington, Lee in the Queen's bedroom, Stas in the Lincoln bedroom. 3 Christmases together in Palm Beach with all the children. The Kennedy investment in the next generation was formalized from the beginning. Jackie and JFK attended Tina's christening at Westminster Cathedral. Jackie was named Anthony's godmother, a specific, formal, documented role that carried both ceremonial and relational weight. But Lee's actual daily life during those years looked like domestic anchoring, then like sustained social performance. The London and New York circuit, the Capote entourage, the parties, the fashion. She confessed to a journalist after her Chicago theater reviews came in, "It's difficult for someone raised in my world to learn to express emotion. We are taught early to hide feelings publicly." She said this about acting. It applies more broadly. The 1970s brought a series of collapses. Lee and Stas divorced in 1974. Stas died in 1976, reportedly owing the equivalent of $30 million to creditors. He had sustained the grand lifestyle on borrowed money, the title serving as collateral for loans that were eventually called in. By around 1975, Lee was reportedly bankrupt. The house of cards that the Princess performance had been quietly assembled on top of fell apart almost simultaneously. Jackie stepped in. In 1976, she established trust funds for both Anthony and Tina, not for Lee. For the children, specifically. She paid for Anthony's schooling. She helped Anthony and his future wife, Carol DeFalco, purchase their first New York apartment. When Tina was 17 years old, in 1977, she moved to live with Jackie. Not temporarily. She moved in. Her mother wasn't in a position, financially, practically, or by any available measure, to be the primary household for a teenage daughter. And then, the clearest documentary evidence of all, Jackie Kennedy Onassis's 1994 will, signed and filed before her death from lymphoma on May 19th of that year. Her total estate exceeded $43 million. She left $500,000 to Anthony, $500,000 to Tina, nothing to Lee. Not a dollar, not a keepsake, not a line. That is a binding legal document, drafted by attorneys, reflecting decades of deliberate financial and emotional choice. Jackie had been systematically investing in the next generation, the children, since 1976. The will formalized what the trust funds and the apartment and the schooling had already established. Jackie regarded Anthony and Tina as her specific financial and familial responsibility, distinct from, and apparently in lieu of, her responsibility to Lee. When people in the comments on videos about Lee Radziwill say she was not a particularly attentive mother, and the commenter who said exactly that has 78 likes and 7 replies, more engagement than anything else in those threads, what they're reaching for is the gap between these documented facts and the sympathetic princess narrative. The gap is real. The specific claim of inattentive mothering is contested. Here is the honest version of what we know. Diana Dubois's biography, In Her Sister's Shadow, published in 1995, meticulously researched, described in its own publisher material as not kind in its portrait of Lee, characterizes Lee as spiteful, self-serving, and uncaring. A woman who struggled with debt and a series of failed professional projects, while her sister quietly became the more reliable presence in her children's lives. That is the texture of their relationship. Jackie as the steady hand, Lee as the person who needed steadying. Those who cared about Lee struggled to explain what they observed in her. Peter Beard, a former boyfriend, described Lee as someone who genuinely needed love, but whose values, the checklist, the money, the glamour, prevented her from getting it. He believed that if she could shed what he called the phony side of her life, she could have been a happy person. These weren't the words of an enemy. They came from people who cared about her and were trying to explain something they found genuinely painful to observe. Carol Radziwill, who married Anthony on Long Island on August 27, 1994, is the closest insider account of the family we have. Her 2005 memoir, What Remains, a memoir of fate, friendship, and love, published by Scribner and reviewed in the New York Times, centers on the summer of 1999 and the losses that preceded it. Carol grew up working class in Suffern, New York. The distance between her background and what she married into runs through every page. Her observation period was limited to 5 years with Anthony before his death, and her characterizations of Lee's parenting are necessarily retrospective. She wasn't there for Anthony's childhood, but she was inside the family when it mattered most. What Remains doesn't yield a specific passage about Lee as a bad mother. The commenter who cited it as the source for that claim may have read something the available excerpts don't surface, or may be extrapolating from the book's broader portrait. What the book does contain is this. Near the end of Anthony's life, with Anthony in a hospital gown and JFK Jr. in a tuxedo, the two men are holding hands and singing. They are in a place that no one else has ever been or could ever go, Carol writes, singing a song that John's mother used to sing to the two of them. John's mother, Jackie, singing to both of them, to John Jr. and to Anthony, a song she'd taught them both. Not Lee's song, Jackie's. Elsewhere in the book, Carol describes the ordinary rhythm of their marriage. We float along on process, Anthony and I. What will we have for dinner? Did you call your mother? What time do you think you'll be home? The phrase, "Did you call your mother?" is small and significant. Anthony called Lee regularly. Contact was maintained. The relationship existed, whatever its texture. Carol herself remained close to Lee until Lee's death in 2019. She published a warm tribute after Lee died, maintaining affection across the full decade and a half between Anthony's death and Lee's own. The picture that emerges from the documented record isn't of Lee as a monster. It's of a woman whose priorities were consistently elsewhere: the performance, the image, the circuit, and of an aunt who consistently stepped into whatever gap the performance left open. Jackie was Anthony's godmother from his christening. She was Tina's de facto household from Tina's 17th birthday. She wrote trust funds for both of them when their father's estate collapsed. She left them money in her will when she could have left it to Lee instead. This is contested territory, and the honest script says so. What is documented? The financial intervention, the godmother role, Tina's residential move, the will's explicit allocations. What isn't documented? Direct on-record statements from Anthony or Tina themselves about who functioned as their real parent. The answer to the "where's the tragedy?" question depends partly on which of these you weight more heavily. The American aristocracy argument provides the wider frame. In the late 19th century, a documented phenomenon emerged that scholars now call dollar princesses. Wealthy American women, primarily from New York, who strategically married into British and European aristocracy to convert financial capital into social legitimacy. A 2024 Seton Hall thesis traces the pattern through figures like Consuelo Vanderbilt, forced by her mother Alva to marry the Duke of Marlborough, Jenny Jerome, who became Lady Churchill, Minnie Stevens. These transatlantic marriages were transactions in which American wealth purchased European titles that American law couldn't recognize. The Vanderbilt family, as one analysis of the dynasty puts it, tried to spend and marry their way into the elite of European aristocracy. Lee's marriage to Stoss fits the template. She had the Kennedy connection, where the Vanderbilts had coal and railroad money. Stas had the title where the Duke of Marlborough had the duchy. The resulting social legitimacy was the same construction either way. American ambition wearing a European label. What the Gilded Age frame requires acknowledging is that the Kennedys were running a parallel performance on the American side. The family was described in historical social research as America's royal family, performing a version of dynastic prestige that the Constitution specifically prohibits the government from granting. PT 109 heroism, Harvard educations, Irish Catholic immigrant origins elevated into a secular aristocracy, constructed, maintained, and carefully projected through media relationships that the family cultivated systematically. John F. Kennedy used television the way Lee used Truman Capote, as infrastructure for the performance of a kind of elevated existence. Both were constructions. Both required sustained belief to function. Lee just had the worst position within the structure. She was performing American aristocracy on one side and European aristocracy on the other, simultaneously, always in someone else's shadow, and doing it on a financial foundation that turned out to be as hollow as the title itself. Anthony Radziwill became a television documentary journalist. He married Carol DeFalco in 1994. He died of cancer on August 10, 1999. 6 days after his 40th birthday. That's the establishing paragraph the story requires, and no more. Because what the career record doesn't capture is the texture of what Anthony's life actually consisted of. The relationships that held him, the people who showed up, the song that his aunt taught him, and that he sang holding his cousin's hand in a hospital room, on what everyone in the room believed might be his last night. JFK Jr.'s plane went down into the Atlantic on July 16, 1999. Anthony survived him by less than 4 weeks. Carol later wrote of that summer. After the summer of '99, the summer they all died. 3 deaths in one family inside a month. John Jr., Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, then Anthony. Anthony served as best man at John's wedding to Carolyn on September 21, 1996. They had grown up together in the overlapping Kennedy-Radziwill family orbit. The bond between them ran through Jackie, who was Anthony's godmother and John's mother, and who sang to both of them the same song. Jackie had died 5 years earlier, in May 1994, of lymphoma, 3 months after Anthony and Carol married. Anthony spent his 5 years of marriage carrying the illness and the absence simultaneously. Tina Radziwill's full legal name is Anna Christina Radziwill. Born in 1960, premature by cesarean, with Lee recovering in London while JFK was inaugurated in Washington, she moved to live with Jackie at age 17 in 1977. She gave a brief public statement when Carolyn Bessette died and appeared in at least one oral history about JFK Jr. She hasn't written a memoir. She hasn't appeared on reality television. She hasn't maintained a public platform of any kind. In a family that produced a first lady, an internationally famous socialite, a journalist memoirist who wrote a New York Times bestseller and appeared on The Real Housewives of New York City, Tina chose something different. Silence, or close to it. The contrast with Carol is exact. Anthony's widow leveraged the family story into a career, a book, a public persona. Anthony's sister put it down and walked away. Her silence may mean nothing. It may be temperament, but it's also possible that when you grew up watching the performance, the title, the mythology, the image editing, the social machinery, and then watched it leave you largely to someone else's household at age 17, you develop a specific relationship to public self-presentation. The performance didn't do what it was supposed to do. There's no obvious reason to keep performing. When Lee died in her Manhattan home on February 15, 2019, her estate was valued at approximately $50 million. Her will identified one child, Anna Christina Radziwill, hereinafter, Tina. The phrasing is simply accurate. Anthony predeceased her in 1999, 20 years before her own death. But there is something clarifying about a woman who had spent 60 years being Princess Radziwill in the social columns, and who died with a will that contained no title, no honorific, just a legal name and a number. The $50 million went to Tina, nothing to Carol, nothing to Jackie's children. Read that document against Jackie's 1994 will, which left $500,000 each to Anthony and Tina, nothing to Lee, out of an estate exceeding $43 million. 2 women, 2 wills, an inverted mirror. Jackie directed resources to the next generation, specifically to Lee's children, as a deliberate financial act over decades. Lee directed resources to the surviving next generation, to Tina, her only remaining heir. Between those 2 documents is the whole story of who actually raised these children and what that raising consisted of and what it cost. Carol Radziwill wrote in What Remains, "Ultimately, what remains is a story. In the end, it's the only thing any of us really owns." The book's title is its philosophy, and the philosophy is correct. The title Radziwill isn't what remains. The princely designation granted by Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in the early 16th century and legally abolished by Polish constitutional law in 1921 isn't what remains. The fabricated French noble ancestry that Jackie and Lee's grandfather invented and a New York Times reviewer called phony isn't what remains. What remains is the record of who showed up, who established the trusts when the money ran out, who housed the daughter at 17, who sang the same song to both children, whose will, not a sentiment, a legally binding document, said $500,000 specifically to these 2 people, and nothing to their mother. Lee Radziwill wasn't a simple villain. The portrait that Du Bois draws, the one that emerges from everyone who knew her, is of a person who genuinely needed love and who had organized her life around the things that made love structurally harder to give and receive. The money, the glamour, the checklist, the performance that left limited room for the unglamorous work of being present. A 2000 New York Times Magazine profile of Lee was headlined, "A New Balance. Lee Radziwill finds serenity in Paris." By that point, Anthony was already dead. Jackie was already dead. The world she had performed for, the Capote world, the Courrèges and Givenchy world, the world where a hollow European title bought access to rooms that opened for nobody else, had dissolved. She found serenity in Paris, which is one way of saying she stopped trying to make the performance work. She lived another 19 years after that. She died at 85 in New York and left $50 million to Tina. The tragedy question, the animating one, where is the tragedy, turns out to have an answer, just not the one the princess mythology was designed to produce. The tragedy isn't material deprivation. Lee was never materially deprived, not at the scale that constitutes actual loss. The tragedy is the gap between the life that was performed and the life that was lived, between the title that no government on earth was obliged to recognize and the trust funds that a sister established for children who needed something more durable than a courtesy honorific, between the christening at Westminster Cathedral with the First Lady and President of the United States present, and the hospital room where the song came from Jackie. Everything else, the title, the mythology, the 50 acres at Turville Grange, was always temporary, the same as everything. Tina knows this, which may be why she's not performing. Subscribe for more stories told without the mythology.